So it's more about the philosophy of it. I think you look at what Gary Vaynerchuk's done with VaynerMedia, it's like, or locally, what Jorg's done with Fast Horse. You have companies that have embraced that and said, we're going to let anybody who's got an idea have an idea. We're going to give them the tools, and we're gonna run as fast as we can with all the tools and all the technology that are available to us. That's just a mindset. It's a way of approaching things. But if you're running a company that needs to make money and or is maybe perhaps publicly owned,
sure, and
you've got longstanding processes and procedures, that nimble, quick-moving mindset is really confusing and maybe even threatening, because you've got habits that say, I'm the writer and art director.
Right. There's checks and balances
in a room, and I come up with the idea. That's my job, and so I'm the one who comes up with the idea. And so then there's a sort of deference that should be paid. It's really hard for people who've lived under that system for a long period of time. That's the old system, to kind of look at it and go, what do you mean the kid down the hall with the iPhone is his campaign is happening versus my campaign?
Right.
And I think that's a lot of what, just in a stereotypical fashion, the ad industry is wrestling with.
Yeah, well, then the other thing that I've seen over the years is when user experience and as a practice started entering, kind of wedging itself between marketing and IT in general. And, these days people kind of understand it, but I remember back in the day, it was a big push-pull.
Right. Who are you with your ideas about how humans interact with ideas, right? and also I think too that there was a hubris in the ad industry, 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s of like, well, we changed the world,
right?
Exactly. We created brands that created incredible market valuations simply because of we had ideas, and that again, it's not wrong, but if that's the only worldview, is a sort of incorrect way of looking at it. And then you look at, user experience comes in, and information architecture comes in, and software thinking comes in and says, hey, we've got data that suggests people interact with your idea differently than the way you think, or that they have opinions, or that users should be empowered. Again, it's a threat to an old way of thinking. Yeah. It's a threat to a status quo. But it also opens up other ways of thinking about the balance between, the marketer and the audience.
There was a lot of posturing on both sides for a long time, right? Because user experience born out of that kind of human factors and those things from days of yore, as it were, had a hard time describing where they should be at, because there was some new things there. Even to this day, when my company Foundry works with some agencies, there's always a question on who's going to do the final visual pass through and the branding, right? It's obvious that we've been brought in to help with the architecture.
Right. It's like, who has control?
Yeah.
And that's a human thing. And it's very... I don't look down on it. It's just like, can we just recognize that that's part of the nature of being human, making anything, art, sandcastles, building a house, paintings. There's a certain amount of selfish control that we want. Like, I made the dinner, I cooked it. Like, I get some pride out of that, and so there's this idea that. Human factors and bringing the audience in and things is somehow a threat, and that's just where the people who are making the stuff have to kind of go. You have to look at yourself in the mirror and kind of ask, am I being a little, am I being a little selfish here? Versus recognizing it's just a new art form.
Yeah.
Photography supplanted oil painting as a means of capturing pictures of people, and it's just a new art form. It's a new way of approaching ideas. And it, more than anything, it's just kind of human folly. I think to look at like the way in which, large entities or agencies react to the irony for me is that advertising is a business of ideas. Ideas are by default a threat to the status quo. Every new idea is a threat to the status quo. And so, but yet we're going to make this digital idea, but then we're threatened by it because it threatens our sense of control. It's like, don't you know who you are and what you're, this is the business we're in. So there's some folly in all of that, which is just, again, it's part of being human.
Yeah, right. Well, and you yourself have, as you mentioned, you teach, you've run your own business, you've worked in leadership roles. How have you found success in coaching people through that? I mean, what are some of the things that have worked for you in the past to kind of pull people's heads out? I mean, is it really just by doing? Is it by example? Is it by, how have you found yourself being able to coach people away to accept these new ideas?
Well, let's think of it. Typically, the younger the people you're working with, the more they just intuitively get the way the world works because they're connected with it. And they're, my 12-year-old has a really strong sense of the way in which mobile devices should operate because he's 12 and he's constantly playing with his iPhone. So of course he's fluent in that. Like he could probably wireframe, a mobile app really quickly just because that's how his brain works and he gets the space. So you're usually talking about helping someone who's a little older, and a lot of it's just about how do I teach curiosity? How do I teach? It's references to say when television came into the business, it was a threat to people who had solved problems and created ideas in static mediums like print.
Right.
And so this isn't new. This change, and it's all change management.
Yep.
Mostly it's about helping people realize this isn't a threat to your mortgage, right? You are still going to have a job. You as an ideas person or a person working in the realm of ideas are still valued.
Right.
You are still important. Your thinking is important. Really what we're talking about is expanding the way in which you think. So it is about helping the painter realize there are other kinds of paint and other kinds of brushes and other ways of approaching painting. It's helping the ideas person recognize that you've typically solved problems with graphic design in words.
Yeah.
Hey, there's dimensionality or dimensional ways of solving problems or human interaction ways of solving problems that let's bring your brain to that kind of thinking as well. And what's awesome is when you get when people they're afraid of it because that's not what I do.
It's new.
And you have to say no. You're an ideas person, writer, art director, designer, whatever. Therefore, you have permission and you have a right and a responsibility to bring your thinking brain, your creative brain into this newer space, which, you may, I don't expect you or need you. Think of the first time that you worked on a TV spot. You didn't know what a grip was. You didn't know what offline meant. You didn't know any of the terminology, but that didn't stop you from participating. So let's not let any of the terminology stop you from participating. Let's encourage a curiosity and an active participation. And when you do your first website, your first, mobile app, your first whatever, and then you start to realize, it is merely another mechanism. It's another media. It's another experience, and then you get surprised by how someone who may be solely focused in graphic design has a really interesting perspective on user experience or language or taxonomy in those environments.
Yeah. Well, do you think that if somebody were starting an agency today, that it just seems they are. It feels like that's just the natural way that they would structure is just like everybody in the pool.
Yes and no. I think it depends on what kind of agency are you trying to make?
Oh, okay. Let's talk through that.
Because is your focus going to be strategy, like upfront, Accenture-esque? What's the business problem we're trying to solve? What is the business you're in? What is the audience you're trying to impact? What are the market factors you're trying to address? So you've got there are more consultative type agencies that are doing that kind of work. And then you segue into the next sort of iteration is to say, well, that's more then it transforms into user experience and UX to kind of identify a way of impacting the strategies that we identified. And then that may even lead to like, well, now we need to make stuff to attract people or persuade people of so then we're making ad-like objects,
Right.
and then we're maybe making then you get into like now we've made software, we've made a website, we've got and now we're into content production because they like our recipes, so they keep coming back for our recipes, so we need to make more of them. And so you've got agencies on that entire spectrum, from business consulting at the front end to content optimization on the other side of it. It's and then you've got I think the bigger challenge is for an agency to say we do all of that.
Yeah,
I don't know how you staff for that and maintain billable hours in that kind of environment.
Yeah, well, but to your point, the difference between coming up with the idea of that we should do recipes in the first place versus what are these 16 recipes that we got to put together going to look like, and what's the tone going to be, and all of that. That's
its own world, right? You can go down the rabbit hole, you can get out the microscope and get really granular at each stage, especially when you get into the content side of it and you start thinking about, optimization and versioning and, hey, we noticed that recipes formatted in version A perform better than version B on Thursday nights. But on weekends, version B does better on mobile devices. So all of a sudden it's like, guess what? There are no wrong answers. And if you're really fortunate, you are able to put out content that meets everyone's needs where they are.
Right.
That's the other thing about old and new. That's kind of a key difference is that the old perspective is we make an idea once and we put it out into the world, and our gut, if we're lucky, our gut was right and it resonates with everybody in a universal way, right? That's when we lived in a world of 3 networks and a few magazines, whatever. But now I can have an idea and I have a version of it that's specifically meant for the Reddit audience, and I have a version of the same idea that's meant for the BuzzFeed audience, and a version of the same idea that's meant for Facebook. And so the core is the same, and then it's a question of budgeting, it's a question of time. But to the thing we were talking about earlier, this idea is now going to live for how long? How long is this idea going to live in the world? The old challenge was we make the idea, we put it out into the world, we go on vacation.
Right.
Because we made the idea, all the hard work's happened. We've put it out into the world. But now we live in this kind of constant churn, and when is an idea ever done? In the world that we live in now, and when are there enough of iterations of that idea? That's the challenge that a lot of brands face now, and marketers and agencies face now of I can make an idea, and I can make to what degree do I want to personalize it? To what degree do I want to make iterations of that idea? And do I have the support systems to do that over time?
Yeah, well, and the conversation has changed too, right? I mean, the narrative, if you will, used to be here's 30 seconds worth of narrative, and now we're done. But the expectation that people have is like, okay, well, maybe I saw your 30 seconds worth, but now I'm going to go check your Instagram.
Right.
And, oh, wait, and your product's listed on Amazon.
Right, yeah.
And, oh, look at the reviews there. But then, there's all this info on Pinterest that people have. So then the narrative starts to become this big, large thing that is really hard to control at that point, right?
Exactly. So. Yeah. And that's, again, it goes back to human control and the sense of the old approach with the agency was we made the thing. We had 100% guaranteed control, and every pixel, every drop shadow, every kerning, all that, it was perfect when it went out. The music industry is the same way.
Okay.
High degree of control. But now we're in a space where the good enough revolution happened, and I would argue if you're making banner ads and things like that, it's a template and it's about versioning. Guess what? We'll take every headline you got. We'll take every layout